hopefully we can get some more people sitting down. Great, so hi everyone, welcome. My name is and I'm one of the many students that have been involved with the Divest Dartmouth campaign over the past couple of months. And first off, thank you so much everyone for coming. We're really appreciative to see so many faces in the room, so many new faces as well, and especially those that have travelled so far to come here tonight. That really means a lot to have support for the student movement, so thank you so much. We'd also like to thank the really large variety of student organisations that have actually endorsed tonight's dialogue. What's been incredible, it hasn't been the usual crowd of environmental groups. Tonight we've got religious groups endorsing the event, we've got student leadership programs, and we've got group houses. It really means a lot to us to have such cross-campus support. So, what do we want tonight to look like? First off, we'd like to say that tonight is about dialogue, and we're going to try and create an open space for everyone's opinion to be heard on these very important issues. Hopefully we can have a discussion that will ultimately shape and better this movement here at Dartmouth. So our dialogue is going to be about the successes and challenges of the national movement, but even more so about its applicability to Dartmouth. We hope that by reflecting on what's happened so far, learning more about the issues at hand and what's been happening around the country, and by answering all of your most pressing questions, we can help shape the strongest possible movement here at Dartmouth. Let's put all ideas on the table about how to create a better future for our students, for our college, and for all of the communities that we're a part of around the world. This is a pertinent time to be discussing these things here at Dartmouth. In the past few weeks, we've seen an upswing in extremely valuable open dialogue, in a commitment to every level to tackling injustice head on. We as students have been given voice to criticize the status quo, and we need to keep the momentum going. We'd like to follow the lead of Swarthmore College, where their recent appeal to the Board of Trustees was for no more business as usual. They weren't just referring to fossil fuel investments, but sexual assault, classism, and racism as well. So, I've said it a few times already, and you might actually still be wondering, what is divestment? Put simply, to divest is to uninvest, to reallocate monetary resources away from a particular industry. This is normally on ethical or moral grounds. Dartmouth actually has a really strong history of divestment. In the 1980s, we were the first Ivy to divest from South Africa under apartheid, which was a move that Nelson Mandela credited with breaking the back of apartheid. In 1993, we divested from a controversial hydro project in Quebec. In 2005, we divested from arms and oil companies in Sudan. And just last year, we finally divested from tobacco. This movement is different. Never before has a move to divest been made from an industry that makes up such a large proportion of our endowment. And never before has a move to divest been made from an issue that affects every single one of us in our society. Now, first, we're going to hear from a number of student speakers. Students that have a story to share on their role as activists today. Fossil fuel divestment is one of the biggest student movements we've seen in a long time, but it's just part of the larger climate, environmental, sustainability movement, however you want to call it. I'm lucky enough to be part of a wonderful community of students here at Dartmouth, and it's wonderful to see so many friendly faces. And we're all working hard every day to try and create a more livable future. So first, we're going to hear from Molly.
I've been thinking a lot lately about why I do the things I do. Because here at Dartmouth, we all face time and budget constraints. I found myself facing incredible time and budget constraints this year. And it just makes me want to think about why I care about the things I care about and what I do on a daily basis. And it reminds me of the importance of being mindful and purposeful in what I do. So in thinking about those time and budget constraints, I've been thinking, what are the things that I really have to do, that I feel like I can't take out of my schedule no matter how many things I have to do in my day. And I realize it's the things that I do because I love to do them and because I need to do them. And not just because there's something that everyone else is doing or that I'm told that I should do. So I'm the type of person that loves to do a lot of things. I love to be in the outdoors. I love music. I love art. But I've realized that if I don't do this meaning climate activism and sustainability, then none of the other things that I do really matter. So that's what I've been thinking about lately, when thinking about why I do what I do. And thinking about divestment specifically, I've also had a lot of time thinking about that in the past few months. And there are definitely many people that are going to say that divestment is not the answer to climate change. And of course, it's not the only answer to climate change. I think all of us up here realize that. But what I've also realized is that we'll never find a perfect answer to any problem, and that maybe the best answer that we can find is many, many different answers. And so that's how you build a movement, is with the many, many different approaches and answers. And then I feel that divestment is what I can do right now as a student, is to be part of this movement. And that's my answer, and that's my part of the solution. That's what I can do. So that's where I'm coming from.
Hello, everyone. It's amazing to see how many people turned out to see and participate in the divestment dialogue. I'm just amazed I've never seen anything like this before. So anyways, I'm Serkes. I'm a dual degree engineering student from Vassar College. This is my first year at Dartmouth, and in finding community, I sought out the sustainability communities here, and I found a really great home with wonderful people. And I guess why I'm here is I want to tell you about my story and my introduction to divestment and why I support it, not really what divestment is. So I was first introduced to divestment by my partner, Noah Balkanoff, who's statue right here. He's leading the divestment campaign at Vassar College. And back in September, I was talking to Noah over the phone, and he was telling me how a representative from Green Corps came to Vassar to ask him to initiate the movement at Vassar. And I was trying to get a handle on what this brand new concept of divestment was. And considering that I'm an engineering and physics student, not a tech student or a finance major or a sociology or a history major, I don't really consider myself having a solid background in historical social movements or divestment portfolios. Though these are things one could begin to conceptualize by reading a few articles on the internet. Once I thought I was more informed on the topic, I still didn't understand how a college, or a dozen, or 100 colleges for that matter, would make a notable financial dent in slowing and eventually stopping the extraction of fossil fuels. And this particularly discouraged me from thinking that divestment was a necessary action. And I don't think I was alone in this sentiment. Though something ended up happening, and I can't really pinpoint exactly what it was. Maybe it was a combination of the dozen or so conversations I had with activist-minded students at Dartmouth. But I came to realize how activism played out in my own life choices. I think there's a term for that called lifestyle activism. I began to see how the conscious choices I made, choices pertaining to my diet, my well-being, my social interactions, my recreational activities, my academic and career goals, and my non-academic and non-career goals, and how those choices affected people around me. And what I discovered was that imposing what I found valuable in my own life didn't necessarily lead to others making an informed decision, especially when their own value systems weren't considered or acknowledged, even if that value system is rooted in something that's nonsensical. With regards to my diet, I saw my parents who are avid meat eaters, mind you, try a vegan diet for a few weeks. And this is after me being vegan for about a year, partly for environmental reasons. And I saw friends of mine here at Dartmouth begin adopting vegetarian or vegan diets, and I think it's partly because of me. And my response to the questions of my friends and family asking why would you want to decrease your consumption of animal products? Don't you miss cheese? And I think my answer to these questions was sort of what instigated change in their own lives. I didn't respond to these questions defensively, and I didn't respond to these questions with an imposition of my own lifestyle. I approached these conversations in a way so that I could provide the opportunity for a learning experience for my friends, family, and for myself. This mindset spilled into other aspects of my life. My family saw me attend the Forward on Climate rally in DC back in February, and passing up a family get-together to attend that. In addition, my friends and family saw me dedicate hours upon hours to environmental groups, such as the Big Green Bus here at Dartmouth. And I think it was my behavior that sparked a curiosity and desire to understand. And by providing the opportunity to learn by example, one can set the stage for change. And in my experience, it takes some time for the planted seed of knowledge to germinate. People come around to doing good, or to doing what people like us, or I'm speaking for myself, think is the right thing to do. I certainly recognize the immediacy in the issues of climate change and how fossil fuel divestment ties into such environmental issues that really don't have time to wait for an overhaul of a person's perception. I'm also not saying that the divestment campaign should have a protracted timeline of efficacy. I'm just observing something that I think is notable, which is how, why, and when people make change in their own lives when the immediacy isn't apparent. I've made the awe-inspiring conclusion that people like to do things that make them feel good. And I think our generation is at a critical point in which the physical and social climate of our world isn't making us feel good. When people don't feel good, they want to change. And when people change, they want to feel good about the change that they make in their lives. And for many, I think this could mean being involved in the environmental movement. Now, considering fossil fuel divestment, I feel empowered to be a supporter of fossil fuel divestment. I'm emboldened by the changes I've seen in my own life and in those around me. And I see the immense potential that fossil fuel divestment has in creating a more striking awareness of the issues around us. This movement, as we all know, is more than just divesting from fossil fuels. It's a social movement that affects all of us. And I think that our generation is coming around to seeing the interconnectedness of the most seemingly disparate issues in our world, as evidenced by the inspiring turnout of an event like this and the co-sponsorship by so many different student organizations on campus that aren't environmental groups. And in light of recent events at Dartmouth, I think that the Dartmouth community is looking for something to unify and propel us forward to change. And I think that the Divestment movement could be part of that. Thank you.
Hey guys, my name is Fredrik. I'm a current 16th student here. And a lot of times when I want to talk about these things, I think it's really important that I come from a place of the heart and so you guys understand sort of who I am and where I'm coming from with a lot of this. And I guess I should start by giving you the context of why climate change and all of these things really matter to me. And a lot of that comes from sort of the experiences I had living in New Mexico for the past few years. And so I grew up in many different places, but I never really had the opportunity to engage with an area where the environment and people were so closely linked. And a lot of that came from just having the opportunity to live in New Mexico. And sort of my transition at that time was coming from Vermont. And from Vermont to New Mexico, the number one thing was the difference is the amount of water that's there. And that, as it turns out, the community I moved into, Las Vegas, is one of the places in New Mexico that's currently facing some of the most significant droughts in the country. And that's something that really impacts the community there very much. The first time that really became open to me was when I was having dinner with one of my teachers in the first 2 weeks of being in school. And I was very used to at home, sort of after a family meal day, and I ended up with my elbows in a tub full of soap and scrubbing up dishes. But there you use half a cup of water, and that's what you have to use. And sort of I guess in telling that story, what I want to share is just that the environment and we as people are intrinsically linked. And it's very hard to sort of separate us from our environment, but it's very easy for us to abstract sort of the impact that we have on the environment. And in that sense, I think that's something that we need to sort of bridge and ameliorate as we go forward in the future. There's no way that we can continue to do the things that we do without recognizing that we are tied to the environment. Because, one of the things that I realized while I was in New Mexico was actually that things in Vermont are also very linked to the environment as well. While I was there, Hurricane Irene came through most of the southern part of the state. Fortunately, I lived just far enough north that where I was living wasn't terribly affected. But a lot of the places that I knew had been, and I didn't know this for a couple of months actually. As it turned out, when I talked to my family on the phone, one of the things I said was, yeah, there's a lot of rain, and it was pretty bad, and it was pretty windy, but we're okay, and I thought nothing more of it. And then about a month and a half later, I Google searched Irene because I had heard sort of other stories, and what I saw was pretty different. A lot of the places that I had seen sort of growing up in Vermont had been dramatically changed from flooding damage, from high waters, and from other factors involved with that. The infrastructure was all destroyed, the bridges were taken out. And that was something that became very real to me. And sort of coupling those two issues was then compounded once again when Sandy came through, and my grandparents were displaced, living on the Jersey Shore. And so all of these factors, while disparate events, while tenuously linked to climate change, as some might say, they are all happening now. They're all happening for very different reasons, but they're all linked to the fact that we are modifying the way that we interact with our world and the way that we're choosing to do stuff. And so when I think about these things like that and these other issues, it comes from a place of the heart. What is it that we're here for that we want to change? What is it that we are doing that we're having an impact on this? And if we can make a difference, how do we do that? And then I kind of think about my role as a student, and it was actually sort of surprising to me when I was asked to speak here that I was being called an activist, because I've never once really thought of myself as an activist. Never used that label before, or that term. But I guess maybe it applies, but what's more important than that is just the fact that we have the opportunity to create change, and we have the opportunity to make a difference if we want to. And so that's something that I've tried to take to heart in the things that I do, and I think it's something that we can all do as students here at Dartmouth. And how does that correlate to divestment, you might ask? And I guess when I think about it, divestment for us as students is sort of a political statement. It's what we have to say yes or no. This is something we support. This is something that we don't. And there's a lot of arguments that go either way. Say, is it we may be divesting, but is that effective? Are we actively creating change? Is the sum of money that we're withdrawing from this industry going to make a difference? And the question is, for me personally, I don't know very much about finance. It's not sort of my area of expertise. I don't know. But what I do know is that that's my way of having a voice, and that's my way of sharing that sentiment. One thing I'm not okay with, though, is simply divesting. It's not okay for us just to stand up and say, we don't want to do this. This isn't part of me. This isn't something that I want to own anymore. If we are actively participating in that through our infrastructure and the way we're involved in our campus. So I guess my perspective in all of this is that I would like to come from a place where, yes, we divest, but we also divest in our actions as well, and do everything that we can to sort of mitigate the hypocrisy that comes with, being part of the fossil fuel economy and also wanting to divest. So I hope that sort of gives you some opportunity to sort of reflect on how these things impact your own lives. I'm sure I'm not the only one in the room who's been affected by these things. In fact, I believe all of you have in one way or another. Sometimes it's subtle, sometimes it's major, and the real difference there is simply in how you choose to proceed. But the reality is, this is the planet that we have, and this is the opportunity that we have to make differences that we want to see in it and on it for the rest of our lives here and for everyone else as well. So, thanks.
It's incredible to see so many people here. Thank you all so much for coming, and thanks everyone who's worked on this. So my name is Leehi. I'm a freshman here, and just so you know a little bit about me, I didn't grow up camping or hiking or spending any time with nature. Didn't consider myself an environmentalist. My parents still think what I do is a hobby and not so much what is my life's passion. So please know that. I will just share one short experience I've had with you. So I'm here because I took an environmental biology course because nothing else was available, and I learned about climate change, and it seemed to me that something that was so big and it was just smacking us in the face, and I didn't understand why action wasn't, at least to me, significant action wasn't being taken about it, and that's what motivated me to change. So I'm not going to talk about what I've done, but I just want to share some of the experiences I've had and the people I've met with you. I was at the Rio Plus 20 United Nations conference this past June, and when I was there, I attended a youth side event, and I struggled as I listened to a young woman about our age, well, university student age, talk about tears streaming down her face, talk about how she lives in a Native American community in North Dakota, and how people who are close to her are dying of cancer at extremely high rates. And as you may know, there's a lot of oil and gas development in North Dakota. And I fought tears as I heard her talk, because feeling her pain, knowing that there's something that isn't right here, was not something I could easily accept. I met fellow human beings from the tar sands region in Alberta, I'm Canadian, the First Nations communities who cannot walk outside without getting a nosebleed or an asthma attack because they are so polluted. I went to another conference in Doha, Qatar, the International Climate Negotiations, where I listened to the lead negotiator for the Philippines, the most respected member of his country who was present at the United Nations, deliver his country's speech to the UN and cry because he, at the same time of delivering the speech, had to hear news from back home that the Philippines was ravaged by Typhoon Bofa, and hearing of his country counting its dead, and hearing about the chaos and destruction there. I hear these first-hand accounts, and I cannot accept the fate that scientists predict for us. I refuse to accept it. I am told that what I do isn't worth my energy, and that climate change is going to happen anyway, and that maybe I can't influence the powers that be. But the reality of it is that as a young person, I don't have another choice. I've had these connections with other global citizens who compel me to act. And I wholeheartedly acknowledge that I use electricity, that to these conferences I did fly, and that I am a part of this system that is dependent on fossil fuels. And that is contrary to discouraging me. That is what empowers me to act, because we do need change, and we need it urgently. This is everything to me. And I know I can't possibly convey how passionate I am about this to you, but Rio Plus 20 was also where I briefly met Bill, right before a bunch of organizations decided to walk out of the conference. And upon enrolling at Dartmouth and coming to the United States, I contacted him and we spoke a bit about organizing and this divestment movement started. So just a little bit of an update on what Divest Dartmouth has done so far. We launched in December 2012, so yes, over winter break we were organizing. We have since had speakers come from 50.org. We have brought dialogue to campus to the point where an introductory environmental studies course is choosing the question of whether or not to divest in their core curriculum. We launched a petition in April that has over 300 signatures to date. We have been contacted by alumni, by community groups who all want to be a part of this. And this event is sponsored by more than 20 very, very diverse groups. And so among other things, this is where we are now. We're here to begin working with administration to talk about how we can make this community a better place and how we can all collectively work to make our global community a better place. So, thank you.
Thank you, everyone. So now we're going to hear from Tempest Williams. Terry's a writer, an activist, a visiting professor at Dartmouth, and the most inspirational woman I know. Her guidance since I took her class at Dartmouth last spring has been invaluable in shaping my outlook, not only as an activist, but as a woman and as a voice crying out for change. Never could I have imagined before Dartmouth that I would consider a professor such a dear friend. She has been a tireless advocate for change for many years, speaking out for women, for the land, for justice, and today she speaks for all of us. Okay.
Good evening. It is such a privilege to be here with you, to be with these powerful student leaders. Thank you, Morgan. It goes both directions. I really want to honor Leehi, Morgan, Molly, Tim, Patrick, all of you student leaders here, many of whom I've had the privilege of working with in environmental studies. I have the privilege of being at a lot of different schools, and no school touches my heart as deeply as Dartmouth. And no school, in my mind, seems more perfectly poised to create this serious conversation about divestment than Dartmouth does. With people like Ross Virginia with Polar Studies, and Kaczynski, who has started this class on divestment, Rosie in sustainability, Terry, who talks about philosophy. I think this is a conversation that is not only crucial to have right now, but critical. And we have a student body that is demanding it. There is a new breeze blowing through Dartmouth, and it is fresh and brave and uncertain. We saw this a few weeks ago when classes were canceled for a different kind of conversation. One that included discussions of sexual assault, of racism, of our fear of other. The conversation doesn't end there, and I think it is this extended conversation that leads us to divestment and life. A different kind of story, a new story. And as Patrick said, it's a story that has everything to do with the heart. The human heart is the first home of democracy. It is where we embrace our questions. Can we be equitable? Can we be generous? Can we listen with our whole beings, not just our minds, and offer our attention rather than our opinions? And do we have enough resolve in our hearts to act courageously, relentlessly, without giving up ever, trusting our fellow citizens to join with us in our determined pursuit of a living democracy? Democracy depends on engagement, a first-hand accounting of what one sees, what one feels, what one thinks, followed by the artful practice of expressing the truth of our times through our own talents, our gifts, and vocations. Question, stand, speak, act. It is time to ask, when will our national culture of self-interest stop cutting the bonds of community to shore up individual gain and instead begin to nourish communal life through acts of giving, not taking? It is time to acknowledge the violence rendered to our souls each time a mountaintop is removed to expose a coal vein in Appalachia. We have made the mistake of confusing democracy with capitalism. And we've mistaken political engagement with a political machinery we all understand to be corrupt. It is time to resist the simplistic, utilitarian view that what is good for business is good for humanity in all its complex web of relationships. What I can tell you as a Westerner who comes from Utah and Wyoming, where you used to see the curvature of the earth, now you see rigs. Towns that used to drink their water, the very companies that filed their water for fracking are delivering them on Mondays. If you've been to North Dakota, it would break your heart with the man camps. If you've been to Florida and the Gulf and seen the wreckage of what BP has left, people that cannot stand to even protest what the dispersants have rendered to them. And just a few weeks ago, I was in Oil City, Pennsylvania, where doors are being knocked on trailers and homes of families who own farms. They're handed a $250,000 check with their name all written on it, saying, all we want to do is drill a well, you'll be rich. They don't talk to them about the poverty that will ensue. And whole families and structures and communities are being torn apart by this. We have to do something. You are calling for a divestment of the future as is now being portrayed. You are calling for an investment in a future that you can imagine. And you have a deep, deep role to play. This is brave. It's not only what is possible, but what is necessary. You are creating a disturbance. I want to honor your disturbance. In honoring the students, I wrote a small piece for this occasion. I don't let my students' apology apologize, and so I will not. But what you have to know is it's with the intention of creating a different kind of metaphor. When I close my eyes, I return to this site of disturbance. It is only a brief walk from our house in the desert, our home. It's a place of sand redistributed by a flood, a flash in the night that came with such force, such velocity, I heard it before I saw it, this thunderous roar. That night, that roar lives inside of me. I opened the front door. The desert was vast and shining, a sea, a mirror reflecting stars. I didn't know where I was. The turbulence didn't register, only the strangeness of water in the desert. The only thing separating the water from me was a dike, built in anticipation of a deluge such as this. I walked up to the dike and witnessed the water moving sideways with such velocity that rolling boulders became a parade passing by with uprooted junipers and cottonwood trees, hundreds of years old, being flushed down valley through the ever-widening arroyo parallel to our house. I stood on the dike alone and watched. A terrifying beauty was eroding the known world before me. There was nothing I could do. And then, as quickly, the flash flood came. It was gone. In the morning, the desert was returned dry. I walked to the place of my midnight dreaming and knelt down to touch the red sand. It was damp. That was all. By the end of the day, that same sand was running through my fingers like sand in an overturned hourglass. I walked back to the house and picked up a rake. I returned to the site of disturbance and began raking sand. I am home in the desert, raking sand. 60 miles north on the banks of the Green River is the site of a proposed nuclear plant. East of Green River, plans have been made for the first tar sands development in the United States to be placed in the heart of the Book Cliffs, one of the wildest areas in Utah, where mountain lions walk the tops of mesas in direct sunlight, like melted butter. And now when you traverse the plateau that leads you to Dead Horse Point, you see more oil rigs and flaming slag ponds than ravens rising from the burnt grasses. America's red rock wilderness is under siege, just like the rest of the world. The New York Times reported on May 10, 2013, that carbon dioxide levels in the Earth's atmosphere have reached, quote, a long-feared milestone, unquote. Scientists say their instrument registered CO2 gas at an average daily level of 400 parts per million. It's been determined by climate scientists the level to maintain is 350 parts per million for a livable future. The CO2 numbers are rising at our own peril. Quote, the best available evidence suggests the amount of gas in the air has not been this high for at least 3 million years. Before humans evolved, and scientists believe the rise portends large changes in the climate and level of the sea. The Earth is a site of disturbance. We are the cause of disturbance. What do we do? I have a friend, and this is the last story I want to tell you. Her name is Trent Alvey, and she makes art. She fashioned a wedding dress made from plastic bubble wrap. It hangs from a whitewashed branch of a disembodied tree. It's a 14-foot shimmering cascade of fossil fuel dreams, where the bubbles of our own illusions are about to pop. She calls her installation Big Bad Love, and dares to ask the question, what are we married to, and what is the nature of our commitments? What contact is she trying to make between the artist and the public? What are we to make of this woman's work at a time when the world seems to split open? Trent has created a site of disturbance, called a flash flood of creativity. This is where we are. How can we help? Each of us must find our own way in our own time with the gifts that are ours as we walk through this labyrinth of terrible beauty. This is the work to do. If Alvey sees marriage as a prison that ties us to a ball and chain of our own making, be it a person or an ideology that tethers us to our own oppression, we are then robbed of the freedom to change and move forward toward a sustainable and meaningful life. We must divest from our current future. We must slip the bubble wrap dress off the branch and make something of it. Herein lies the irony of her project, Big Bad Love. The transparent bridal gown becomes a garment of transgression. We've committed ourselves to a lie. The garment of our illusions and captivity with its inherent bow toward the profane becomes a sacred garment of exposure, revealing our nakedness and vulnerability as human beings. We must wear it, own it, and shame ourselves silly and laugh at the horror of Medusa. To be able to grow into this gown of astonishing proportions and wear it ritualistically, as the sight of our own awareness becomes a revolutionary and evolutionary act. We stand brilliantly, foolishly, caught and exposed, modeling our own marriage to madness. The marriage cannot last. We are disturbed. Let us look in the mirror. We have never been here before. Whenever I close my eyes, this is where I locate myself, in a raking sand in the desert. To Bill McKibben, I know that Morgan is going to introduce you, but as your friend and fellow sister in change, one of the elders made this at the powwow here at Dartmouth yesterday. She knew it was going to you, and she says thank you, as we all do here at Dartmouth College. Thank you.
Thank you, Dave. So as I know is true for so many of you in this room, we've grown into our places in this movement, Bill McKibben at the forefront of it. The climate action organization that he co-founded, 350.org, so named for the parts per million in the atmosphere we need to somehow return to from 400 to avert catastrophic climate change, has led the charge around the world in bringing light to the action we need. This divestment campaign is just the latest of many high-profile, powerful campaigns to come out of his organization. Bill's leadership is inspirational, and we're very thankful he could be here tonight to mark what is hopefully only the beginning of Dartmouth's divestment campaign.
Thank you enormously. What a pleasure to hear everybody talk and so eloquently. And of course to hear Terry talk and read. You all know her as a great writer and teacher, and she is one of the great writers that we have in the whole country, in the whole English language. But she's also a terrific activist. And I was sitting there thinking, she and her husband Brooke in the front row were absolutely central, among other things, in making sure that about 2 million acres of southern Utah got set aside as a wildland 20 years ago now. And if they hadn't done what they've done, that land would be turned into something else already. It's a really good example of how people standing up to make change happen, which we need to have happen. I was thinking of something Patrick just said, that he wasn't used to thinking of himself as an activist. And really, I'm not either. I'm a writer by trade and training, and I wrote the first book about climate change 24 years ago now, which is how I sort of got into this mess. And it was only 5 or 6 years ago that it just became clear to me that our political systems were not making the change that we needed. Mostly because of the incredible power of the fossil fuel industry, political power and wealth enough to prevent change from happening, which they effectively done. And so we did start 350.org and went to work, and it's been interesting work, sometimes painful, because you meet people all over the world, and when you've met them, you have no choice but to be kind of involved in what's happening in their lives. So, tonight I'm thinking hard of our colleagues in Burma and Bangladesh. There's a cyclone now in the Bay of Bengal that's supposed to hit sometime in the next 36 hours or so. And the Bay of Bengal is apparently hotter than has ever been recorded there. And so that cyclone will, of course, be dangerous and powerful. And just one of the things that now happens someplace around the world every day on this changed earth. Earlier today, the great British economist Lord Nicholas Stern, put out a new paper saying that we should expect hundreds of millions of refugees by mid-century on the course that we're on, hundreds of millions of climate refugees. There's already tens of millions of them. And the sad news is that those of us, well, I'm at Middlebury, where I teach, and y'all are at Dartmouth, and that cyclone, to one degree or another, bears our name as it works across those hot water. Because we've been willing to invest in the companies that have prevented change from happening. The fossil fuel industry that has done everything that it can to make sure that we do not get off and die of coal and gas and oil that scientists have now told us is ruinous, and whose ruin we can see with our own eyes. Last summer, the Arctic melted. New cryosat data, which I'm pretty sure they have good access to at the polar studies facilities here, show that about 80% of the summer sea ice in the Arctic that was there 40 years ago is gone. We've taken one of the largest physical systems on Earth and we've broken it. And we're going to keep breaking things because the fossil fuel industry has in its reserves 5 times as much carbon as the most conservative government or scientist on Earth thinks would be safe to burn. 5 times as much as would take us past 2 degrees. If we took seriously that 2-degree target that all the nations of the world have signed on to, then they would have to keep most of that carbon in the ground. And as HSBC and Citigroup said in separate reports within the last 6 weeks, that would necessitate cutting the share price of our fossil fuel industry in half. So just be clear, if you own this stuff, the bet that you're making is that the world will do nothing about climate change. Because if it does, then the value of those stocks will fall. They will do everything they can to keep that from happening. That's why, for instance, the largest campaign donation in the Post-Citizens United world came from Chevron 2 weeks before the last election, determined to make sure that the House of Representatives stayed in the hands of climate deniers. It was successful. Nothing will happen in Washington for the next couple of years. It's why we have to fight. Undermine that power. We do not think that by divestment we can bankrupt Exxon. We do think that we can begin to weaken their political power. That's what happened with South Africa when Nelson Mandela got out of prison. I mean, the same people who had said, or the same kinds of people who say now, oh, divestment isn't going to do anything, or there's some easier way we can do this, or we'll just, I'll put a little pressure on, whatever they're saying. They were saying that about South Africa too. When Nelson Mandela got out of prison, the first place he went was the United States, and he did not go first to the White House. He went first to California to thank students in the UC system who forced the divestment of $3 billion worth of stock, one of 155 campuses, including Dartmouth, that had done that. And what he said was, we fought for our own liberation, but we couldn't have done it without your help. And that's even more true in this globally interlinked world we're in now. That's why Desmond Tutu, Mandela's great accomplice who won the Nobel for his work to fight apartheid, made a little video for us when we were starting this campaign. And he said, if you could see what's going on right now in Africa, the famine and the drought, you would understand why I'm asking you to take up this same tool again that you took up 25 years ago. Normally, when we have a problem with the company, we don't need to divest. We do shareholder engagement and have proxy fights and boycotts and all those kind of things. Apple isn't paying its Chinese laborers enough. That doesn't mean that we have to hate on iPhones. There's a flaw in the business plan and we can fix it. But with the fossil fuel industry, the flaw is the business plan. And that's why we need very quickly to figure out this is how to weaken their political power. Let me just say quickly, because I'm more interested in hearing what you all are thinking about this, but let me just say that as we've watched this develop now in about 340 campuses around the nation, a few things keep coming up that are really important. One is that administrations and administrators keep saying, oh, well, we kind of like the but it would be hard. All our funds are commingled with other funds, or we have to, things like that. True, it is not absolutely snap simple to do. That's why students have said take 5 years to wind down your positions once you've made this public commitment. But on the list of things that we're going to have to do to deal with climate change, all of which are hard because this will be the biggest transition that we've ever made as a planet, on that list of hard things, this is one of the easier ones to do. And if your current set of investment advisors won't do it easily for you, one of the good things about having a couple of $1 billion in your endowment is capitalism works. You can find somebody else who will do with your money what you want done. Second thing is it doesn't come at endless, huge expense. The only academic research we have on this shows that the theoretical risk to return, if you backcast, would have been less than a basis point. In fact, as Tom Steyer, the hedge fund billionaire who built one of the largest hedge funds in the country, and then this year announced that he was selling all his fossil fuel positions, said, not only am I doing this for moral reasons, I'm doing it because this carbon bubble is real, and because you have a chance to get out ahead of it. You are in a better place at a university than you would be elsewise. Other people are sort of left reading Rupert Murdoch's Wall Street Journal for investment advice, but a place like Dartmouth has a physics department, and that physics department has been warning for a very long time that there is more carbon in the ground than we can afford to burn. And it's an opportunity to do the right thing and, in fact, do good for yourself along the way. But those practical considerations, in the end, are not the real key. I mean, the real key at some level is deep moral point. If it's wrong to wreck the climate of the planet, then it is wrong to profit from that wreckage, which is precisely what we all are doing at the moment if we're at institutions invested in this way. Colleges like Dartmouth have boasted correctly about how they're working to green their campus. And Dartmouth's done significant and interesting work along this way. It has more to do, especially with its heating plant and things like that. But to boast about those things and then not address the endowment is strange. If it's important to green the dining hall, then it's just as important to green the portfolio. It's not like there's some separate thing. They're all part of the campus. In fact, it's particularly important, though others are taking up this call. And so far, 11 cities, including Seattle and San Francisco, have announced their plans to divest. It's particularly important to do it at universities, because universities make clear the special generational component about climate change that makes it so odd. Normally at a college, what we do, more or less, is have old people tell young people things. That's the basic model of the college. Basically, it's pretty good, the theory being that we've picked up something along the way that might be worth sharing with you, and in certain cases that's even true. But in this case, it gets flipped on its head. Because, I'm going to be dead in 25 years, if not sooner. Which means I will have gotten to live most of my life not in the shadow of climate change. It's now happening, and happening hard. I mean, Irene was a pretty good wake-up call for all of us in these valleys about what's going on. But if you're 20 right now, you get to live for 60 or 70 years on this planet, and those rising lines of temperature and sea level will run right over your lives unless we head it off fast. And so moral authority shifts in this case, and it's time for trustees and administrators and professors to follow the lead of students in this case and get behind this movement. It's particularly important, I think, for faculty to be engaged. There was ever an excuse, ever a good reason for tenure. It was precisely situations like this to go to work on this kind of thing. with a vengeance. Let me just end by saying, it's very good to work to perfect one's own life and to work to perfect one's own place. And it's good to do that work. Given the short time, the short window that physics leads us to deal with climate change, we also have to work and as effectively as we can at changing structures and systems that drive us. Had we 100 years, then slow cultural change, one person at a time would be all that we needed and the perfect thing. We do not have 100 years. There are people who are in refugee camps tonight. And it makes me think, the first time that I ever came to Dartmouth as a young reporter in New Yorker magazine, fresh out of college myself, and I was up here because your predecessors at this campus who were fighting apartheid in South Africa had erected a shanty town on the green. And it was a place where people said, if our college is comfortable with profiting from people who make people live in conditions like this, then we will live in those conditions too. And it was powerful witness, and it was a bad moment when I was up here because some students had decided that they would go in and wreck that shanty town, tear it down, and it was a horrible moment, but one Dartmouth campus rallied around and led to that divestment that Morgan was describing. We need you to rally in the same kind of way again. There's a plaque on the wall in here that talks about the time that Dr. King came to speak in this room. You know, we don't have any Dr. Kings in this movement. Okay? It's a lack. We could use great charismatic moral leaders. We don't have. What we do have is this movement now, interconnected, rising up all over the planet. I can't tell you we're going to win, but I can tell you that people everywhere have their eyes on what you're doing. Last week at the Bowdoin, students erected a kind of mock refugee camp out on the quad and moved into it, sort of like those shanty towns some time ago. And one of the first things that happened was an elder from the atoll called Takalau in the Pacific, a place where the water is rising so fast that people are having to evacuate their homes. We work in every country but North Korea. So he heard about this. He saw, I don't know quite how, one of the messages go out. He sat down and just wrote a note to those kids saying, thank you so much for doing this. We're not going to drown peacefully here. We're going to fight every inch of the way. And we need you to fight for us, and we need you to tell your elders to do the right thing. That, I think, is what we've got to keep in our heads and hearts going forward. No guarantee that any of this is going to work, but it is incredibly good to see this battle engaged in so many places, including here in Hanover. Thank you guys for listening.
Thank you so much, Phil. Lastly, we're going to hear from Professor Sundaram, a member of the finance faculty at Tuck. His expertise is in valuation, mergers and acquisitions, corporate governance, and financial strategies for profitable growth. He has pioneered many MBA and executive education courses, including the first MBA course on climate change. In 2008, he created the fossil fuel beta, a metric to measure the stock price impact of a company's exposure to fossil fuel price changes and CO2 emissions risks. We're incredibly grateful he can be here with us tonight to provide the financial perspective on divestment and hopefully get some of the dialogue going that we hope to have with you guys here tonight. Thanks.
I'm recovering from a broken femur. I'd like to pick up where Professor Professor McKibben left off, the shanty towns. I first came to Tuck in 1987, and the shanty town was in the green. I was quite impressed. The president of Dartmouth set up an ad hoc council to explore the issue of divestment from South Africa. And I was the Tuck representative to that council. And we recommended divestment. In part because it was easy to do. 26 years later, I'm proud to be, I went away, came back to Tuck. As Mom just mentioned, I created the first course in a US business school, certainly, on climate change. And it's a course that explores the interactions between business and climate change. And divestment is a significant piece of it. What I want to take the next 10, 15 minutes to do is to raise some issues from a somewhat different perspective, one that you may not think about in the environmental studies courses that you take, in some public policy issues that are raised. But before I do that, let me stipulate a couple of things. I think if we can get to a world with 350 ppm, that is just phenomenal. That 280 we can be better, and I have deep admiration for people like Professor McKibben who are trying to move the needle, who are trying to create the aspirations to make that happen. I think it's simply phenomenal, and it's great to see all of you here obviously passionate about this issue. But let me sort of address the divestment piece of it. How many of you here have taken a class in economics or finance? Because I've got about a minute of jargon that I want to. So, if something doesn't make sense, just turn around and ask the person next to you. First, in very simple economics/finance terms, what is divestment? Simply put, it's getting rid of stocks from your portfolio, or assets from your portfolio, more generally. And in principle, how does it work? You sell, prices fall, and expected returns from that asset then rise. And then we use a bit of finance jargon called, therefore, the cost of capital for the company rises. Therefore, things that were profitable, valuable, or more precisely what we call positive net present value investments before, become negative net present value investments, thereby making it unattractive for these companies to invest. And one example of that phenomenon at work is what Professor McKibben mentioned, the notion of unburnable carbon. I'll actually come back to that. The fact that there are fossil fuel reserves in place today that are 5x the amount of fossil fuels. In fact, with 1x or 1.5x, we'll get to a 2 degree centigrade world if the science is to be believed. And it is to be believed, as best as we can tell today. But that's presumably how divestment works. So let me start with the question. Will colleges divesting move the needle? Now, according to recent data that I've seen, there are 830 colleges, or data from 830 colleges. They collectively have about $400 to $450 billion in endowment, of which 15% are in stocks, in equities, in US stocks, and another 15% in international stocks. Let's just focus on the US for a second. 15%. So that's somewhere between $60 and $75 billion in investments in US stocks. And if you have the same proportion in that 60 to 75 billion as that which is invested in energy, and I'm being broad here, I'm including everything, I'm going to attribute energy as being equal to fossil fuels, just to simplify matters. In the US stock market overall, roughly 10 to 12% of stocks are in energy. So, 10 to 12% of 60 to 75 billion, we're talking about somewhere between $6 to $8 billion in college endowments in energy stocks. Even if we could get rid of that entire lot, 6 to 8 billion, will it move the needle? The answer, unfortunately, is no. Why? Because in the US alone, there were 1.5 plus trillion, that's 1.5 trillion dollars worth of market cap in energy stocks. So we're talking about 0.4%, 0.4% of investments that even colleges were to get rid of. So, now, you might say, look, it's only 0.4% of the total equity invested in energy. Why not get rid of it anyway? We've got to be extremely careful about a dangerous slope, a slippery slope. I'm passionate about climate issues myself. But there are equally passionate people with extremely legitimate claims to a whole host of issues. Tomorrow we can say, look, we should divest Nike because of child labor, Apple because of suicides at Foxconn, Coca-Cola and McDonald's because of obesity, private equity portfolios because of outsourcing, Disney because of fires in Bangladeshi factories. I mean, I could go down the list. Walmart because of guns and bribery in Mexico. Where do we stop? So we've got to be very careful. In other words, if I'm an endowment manager at Dartmouth, I've got to, there's a bigger picture that I need to worry about. In fact, it probably wouldn't matter a whole heck of a lot to take a little piece of my portfolio and get rid of it for a lot of potential hassles that might arise. But I've got to be extremely careful about the slippery slope. So I worry about, A, the fact that it is unworkable. More important, I worry about the fact that it is potentially unfair, actually borderline unethical. Let me explain why. If for various reasons, think about the role that the endowment plays in an institution like Dartmouth. Out of the roughly $280 million that Dartmouth spends on tuition, but $80 million is scholarships, assistance, and who does that go to help? The poorer, the less well-off amongst you and your colleagues. That's roughly 30-35% of the tuition that is funded by the endowment. I might be off by a couple of percentage points here or there, but look, even if it wasn't there, that would be like your parents, the average person here, his or her parent, having to sign an extra $18,000 check per year to Dartmouth so that you could afford this $55,000 per year college education. And I go, if it was easy to get 350 ppm without these sorts of trade-offs, where the students that are less able to afford an education such as the one you get from Middlebury or Dartmouth are not affected, I'm all for it. But there are trade-offs involved. In fact, there is another larger kind of unfairness I worry about, which is that it is not just, it's the poorer countries in the world that get affected if fossil fuels were to disappear tomorrow. 85% of our energy comes today from fossil fuels, that's the unfortunate fact. And energy that is cheap and reliable is the basis for wealth creation. You have billions of people, just take India and China, 2.5 billion people on per capita incomes of roughly $3,000 per year, aspiring to get to not where the US is today, which is, believe it or not, roughly $45,000 per capita in a country like the US. The average Indian or Chinese person is not aspiring to get to $45,000 tomorrow. They're aspiring to get to, and some would say it's actually immoral to deny them that aspiration, aspiring to get to maybe $15,000 per capita, 15 years from now. You can do the math. They can't get there without cheap, reliable energy. And today, unfortunately, that comes from fossil fuels. So there's this element of unfairness tomorrow if we get rid of fossil fuels that we have to worry about. 3, it actually kind of troubles me that this is unnecessary. And why do I say that? Look, at the end of the day, countries don't end it. Companies end it. People end it. And companies emit power because they're the ones that ultimately burn fossil fuels too. And they don't do that because they wake up in the morning and say, oh, today I've got to go emit. No. They're producing goods and services for you and I, we, the people, that we want to consume. Okay? And unfortunately, as I said, the nature of this production system today is 85% of the world's energy comes from fossil fuels. And then you might say, heck, if they're responsible for it, they're darn well responsible for making sure that we transition to a world in which this becomes less of an issue. And guess what? That is exactly what is happening. There's a remarkable amount of things happening under the radar in the forward-thinking companies of the world. That is stunning. I spend a lot of time in that world. You'd be amazed at how companies are trying to get rid of the carbon issue, trying to become more carbon efficient in everything that they do, trying to use non-fossil fuel-based sources of energy in everything that they do. But the transition is not easy, cheap, costly. In fact, it is not just the regular manufacturing companies that are doing this. There's actually many fossil fuel-based companies. They worry about stranded assets. They worry about the carbon bubble. They worry about assets that in a world of the price of carbon, that could suddenly be worthless. They're not stupid. They want to get in front of it. But, in fact, just as a quick aside, pretty much every European oil company has signed on to a carbon pledge, and they're all for the cap and trade system in Europe at this point. In fact, when in 2009 we had a huge policy debate here on the mess of a bill called Blackman-Markey, that came into it, well, it didn't come into being, came up for discussion, actually got to a point where the Chevrons of the world, they weren't quite for cap and trade, but you could convince them of a carbon tax, Exxon Mobil. My point is, many people are already trying to get in front of this issue. I prefer a situation in which we work with these organizations to say, look guys, how do we move the needle? Let me finally end with one final point. I really worry, at the end of the day, yes, it's maybe unfair, it's perhaps unworkable, maybe it's unnecessary. And I also ask myself, is this really a planet-friendly policy? I think it's actually kind of unplanet-friendly. What do I mean by that? Look, when you strip away a lot of complexities, there are only three ways to deal with climate change. You can say, I've got to burn fossil fuels, but I'll be more carbon efficient in the way that I do. Two, you say, look, I need energy. I've got to maybe start thinking of non-fossil fuel-based sources of energy to do. But three, there's another remarkable potential technology that's still around the corner that the global policy community has finally recognized a huge role for. That is to say, look, there's a limit to how much of the first two that I can do. Maybe I can burn fossil fuels, but I can figure out intelligent, smart, sustainable, safe ways to capture the carbon that I burn, put out there, and put it away for good. Carbon capture and sequestration is what people call it, CCS technology. And you know who's at the forefront of that technology? It's the oil companies. Why? Because it's a technology that they use to enhance their oil recovery. They pump CO2 under the ground. The point that I'm simply getting at is to say that can we find a way to work with these companies? Can we find a way to channel your passion, your energies, that instead of in-your-face approach that says, oh, get rid of it, and may not even move the needle for all we know, instead say, guys, do the right thing, and work with, form partnerships with these fossil fuel-based companies to transition to the right world. And let me end there. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Now that we've heard from all of our speakers tonight, we're going to begin to take questions from the audience. First, I'm just going to give Bill a chance to respond to the professor, and then maybe we'll begin some back and forth up here. And then
maybe I'll just do it from right here if people can hear me okay. Oh, you can get a microphone back if you want. Well, look, thank you so much, Professor. Very useful. Let me just go down these objections because let me stand up over here. That work? Okay. Let me just go down these objections because they're the standard ones that one hears again and again, and they have, I think, relatively easy answers. I provided the first one, the thing about the slippery slope, I think, in my talk. This isn't Apple and Foxconn or Disney and Bengali factories. In this case, there's not a small problem in the business plan that can be fixed. The problem is the business plan. So it's very different from these other situations. As Naomi Klein, the great activist on these things, said not long ago, when we go to work on sweatshops, it's not because we hate T-shirts. It's because we need to get better conditions there, and we do. This is a very different case. Second thing, will it move the needle? The point that I'm trying to say throughout is not that we expect to bankrupt Eriksson. There's not enough money available in college endowments or anything else to do that. Although, as this begins to spread off campus and into places like big pension funds that have begun in many places to divest, those numbers go steadily up. But the point, really more importantly, is the political statement that comes when important places like Dartmouth say, we're not going to be in bed with these companies. We now recognize them, given the math, to be outlaw companies. Not outlaw against the laws of the state, which they largely get to write, but outlaw against the laws of physics, with 5 times as much carbon as they can burn. The professor's done a good job of explaining how de minimis the actual amounts are in a place like Dartmouth, which makes moot the argument that somehow this is going to require everybody here to write an extra $18,000 check for their tuition. If we're talking about a vanishingly small part of the portfolio, then clearly those economic impacts are not going to be on any kind of scale like that. And as I explained, serious professional investors think that it might well be a way to get you out ahead. At any rate, the only academic research shows that the effect is theoretical risk to return is 0.0034% or less than a basis point. The fact that it's somehow unethical because poorer countries would be affected if fossil fuels disappeared tomorrow. Fossil fuels, A, are not going to disappear tomorrow. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about trying to set the stage so we can begin the task of getting rid of them instead of increasing their use constantly. And of course, it's poorer countries whose governments are making the strongest demand for precisely what I'm talking about. Place after place. The 20 poorest countries in the world came together to underwrite the report last September that made it clear that we're looking at 100 million deaths by 2030 from fossil fuel in the poorest countries in the world. That's why they've pushed harder, those countries, not for the 2-degree target that the U.S. favors and that we finally ended up sort of agreeing on. That's why the poorest countries in the world have pushed hard for a 1-degree or a 1.5-degree target, which would be much smarter, but which the U.S. and others will not let us pursue. But it's precisely those countries and the people in them, like, for instance, Desmond Tutu, who have asked us to do what we're doing now. Finally, the notion that companies do what they do because of our demand is, at some level, true. And we need individually to change our lives. My guess is that most people in here have done that and understood that we're not going to make the math of climate change work in time, one light bulb or one Prius at a time. We're also going to have structural reform, which is precisely what those companies have prevented happening. There are plenty of companies in this world that are working hard to do the right thing and reforming their operations so they use less fossil fuel. It's just that they're not in the fossil fuel sector. It's why we're not asking to get rid of every company in your portfolio because they use fossil fuel. We're trying to get rid of the ones with big carbon reservoirs whose business plans, if carried out the way that they've filed with the SEC and everything else, would lead precisely to the fate that Professor Anant described so profoundly, this 5x amount of carbon in the atmosphere. The forward-thinking companies of the world are not in the fossil fuel sector. The fossil fuel sector is doing precisely the opposite. So, for instance, Exxon, the CEO of Exxon said last summer that it's true that global warming was a problem. He said that this problem was an engineering problem that would have engineering solutions. Asked what they might be, he said, well, if we have to move the crop production areas of the world, then we will. Right? By crop production areas, he meant what most of us refer to as farms. And the notion that we were going to move them someplace, it's true that last year Exxon and their like made it too hot to grow corn in the richest farmland in the world, in places like Iowa. And it's also true that they've helped melt the tundra. That doesn't mean we can move the grain belt up to Siberia and start over again. There's no soil there. These are precisely the people who have made absolutely sure with massive donations to climate denial think tanks, to politicians who have done everything that they can to stymie this, are precisely the people who have made it impossible for us to change, and precisely the people you can begin to leverage if you stand up and do something about it. Not the easy thing, not the, oh, well, let's keep talking as we've done for the last quarter century that's seen carbon go into the atmosphere at an increasing rate and the temperature rise at an increasing rate, but finally starting to do a few of the hard things. When Dr. King came here to talk to you 40 years ago, he didn't say, find the easiest thing you can do and do it. He said, do what needs to be done. And that's where we are now.
Very briefly, I'm not going to respond to every point. I will just clarify a couple of points. The thing about the $18,000 check was only if we went down that slippery slope and endowments disappeared tomorrow. So I phrased that very carefully. In fact, I'd be the first to say that getting rid of, in fact, I think I said that, fossil fuel companies from Dartmouth's or college portfolios is not a huge deal, really. But where I take huge issue, and I teach in a setting where we worry about business models every day, every hour, all the time. We know a lot about business models. And Bill, with all due respect, it is completely incorrect to say that it is not part of Apple's business model or part of the T-shirt makers' business model, and if you go down the list, that you don't have the supply chain, the value chain that you set up around the world that exists today. And that too, in turn, driven by our need for cheap iPhones and cheap T-shirts. And, I could go down the list. So the business model argument that you make about fossil fuel, and incidentally, that distinction between consumers or the producers of fossil fuel versus the industries that consume it is a somewhat artificial one, because tomorrow, if they did not have the fossil fuels to consume, they couldn't produce the goods and services that they produce on our behalf. Just as if the T-shirt makers didn't have the Bangladeshi factories, they couldn't sell it at the $9.99 that we want to buy that. So it's very, 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 very much a part of their business model. It's a very false distinction. I have to make that point clear. The second point about unburnable carbon, again, one thing I will point out, if you actually read that report carefully, it turns out 70% of the unburnable carbon are assets that belong to states, not publicly traded companies. It's the Saudi Arabias and the Venezuelans and the Mexicos and the Colombias and the, etc. of the world. So even if we could penalize the fossil fuel companies for their unburnable carbon or for their carbon bubble, there is still the question of what do we do with the other 70%. And I could go down other points, but I just wanted
that's
to...
actually that's a really good question, that there's a lot of this stuff that's outside companies, which is why we work in all those places. Today, activists were at, and with some success, in Oslo for the annual meeting of Statoil, the single biggest of all these sovereign wealth funds in the world, and making great progress in pressuring them in just the same ways. And it's the same kind of people doing the same kind of thing. So that's a very good point.
Okay, great. If anyone has
any questions at all for any of our speakers here tonight? Thanks. We're just going to have you stand up and speak loudly.
Maybe you can paraphrase the question they're asking.
Sure. Okay.
Go first. Do I have to stand up? I have one question. Okay. I guess my first question I'm wondering, I don't think you're probably going to answer this one, is why will you chose divestment as, I know it followed your Do the Math tour, but why, why divestment? We've been thinking a lot about divestment in Dartmouth and how that national movement becomes personal to our college, and have struggled with why divestment would be our logical next step.
Sure.
And so I'm wondering why you chose that.
Very good question. Why did people choose divestment as a kind of tactic to be thinking about? Well, the first thing to be said, of course, is that it's only one of many tactics that we need and one of many that we're engaged in. So we work all over the world, and there's different things going on everywhere and different things going on in this country. If you're signed up at 350.org, sometime in the next couple of days, you'll know about this big wave of civil disobedience at fossil fuel sites around the country that'll be happening in July. Some of you know we've fought hard this Keystone Pipeline. But we're tired of simply playing defense against bad projects. We need to play offense and go on the offense against the companies that are precisely the problem here. So when you look at the history of effective action against big corporations in this country on this kind of scale, one of the few good examples is the South African example, where we faced all exactly the same set of objections that been made about this tonight, but where students were able, and faculty and alumni, to push through and see real success as a result. And it was up against just the same kind of big companies who are making just the same kind of arguments. Oh, it's better for us to be in South Africa because we can help the people there and we'll be a progressive force and whatever. And happily, there were people like Mandela to say, no, don't do it. One of the reasons I think that it's important for colleges is, for a little while, you guys are semi-trapped inside a bubble for your time here. Not completely. You get study abroad, you have trimesters where you're gone someplace else, so on and so forth. But in those 4 years, it's important to figure out a way that you can really move the needle in large ways. Some of that's perfecting your campus, and it'll be a good thing to figure out how you're going to shut down the boilers that are burning a couple of million gallons of number 6 oil every year, and you probably should have figured out that a while ago. But that's not as important in the long run as affecting the kind of structural change that we have to affect very quickly. Remember what the basic source of the problem overall here is. We have one industry on Earth that's allowed to throw out its waste for free. Okay? The fossil fuel industry are the only guys in the world that get this perk. It's why it's the most profitable industry in the world, and why they will go to the mat time and again, basically to make sure that that doesn't change or changes in only very small and very slow ways. And that's why you guys can exert such powerful leverage even from inside this bubble. Everybody knows, in the rest of the country, everybody has an image of Dartmouth as the most connected to Wall Street of almost any university in America, okay? And hence, if you guys are able, I don't know if you can win. I mean, I don't know who's on your board of trustees, and I don't know if you can win whether that's possible or not, okay? But if you can fight, if you can make a powerful fight out of this, it will be an enormously important statement going forward over the next few years at a crucial time. It will help weaken this industry because it will be on the defensive all the time, having to explain why it's not an outlaw industry, why it's okay to be doing what it's doing. You'll be causing serious problem for it in conjunction with students all over the place. And not just in the United States. I mean, this is spreading fast around the world. Yesterday at Oxford, students were in powerful demonstration about just the same sort of thing. I'm on my way to Australia in a few days, in New Zealand, where this is bubbling up fast. In fact, the largest Protestant denomination in Australia, just announced it was divesting its fossil fuel stock. A powerful statement in a country where coal mining is such an important force. So this is happening quickly. One of the reasons that we got to do it is that we need, given the hole that we're now in, given the fact that the Arctic melted, we need some, as Terry said, some very disruptive things happening. Some things that not ease the status quo, continue the conversations that have been going on for 25 years, look for incremental progress at the best corporations. Well, we've been doing that for the last 25 years. The Arctic melted. The ocean became 30% more acidic. It's not a plan that yields change in the time that we have. So we need to do some things that are disruptive, and that's precisely what, at its best, this will be. So I don't underestimate how difficult it will be to do here. Know that this is a hard place to do it. Many colleges are, not all. 5 have already divested. The 5th actually happened last weekend, and it'll announce it officially tomorrow, so you can't tell anybody. But it's Green Mountain College just across the border of Vermont. A place that has a strong commitment like this one to sustainability and is at this point willing to walk the talk, you know. So what you do here will be very important, and that's why we chose this path.
I have a question. I don't know if everybody can get their head around this question since the discussion so far has been focused on divestment. But I keep thinking immediately about, well, then what should we reinvest in? And I partly want to ask that question because we all know, and there's been tons of research that shows that one of the reasons the fossil fuel companies have as much economic and political power as they have is because of all the subsidies that they had at the start of their industry, they still have today. And we know that one of the big problems that's been the barrier in Washington, D.C., is we're not getting the same kind of level playing field in terms of subsidies to help with the R&D and investment in renewable energy technologies. And we also know from lots of research that lock-in in infrastructure is one of the hard things to get out of. So I keep thinking that wouldn't the divestment movement be more effective and more powerful if it's very closely linked to very strategic thinking about what to reinvest in? And so I would very much like to hear from a number of you on stage, I guess particularly from Bill, since you've been so involved in leading the divestment movement. And by the way, I'm a professor whose class is doing a project on this, and we're trying to talk about it from all perspectives. And one of the topics that students can choose is that very question of how would you operationalize divestment and reinvestment?
So, I mean, part of the problem here is, we're not equipped to be stock pickers, and say precisely where. That's why you have investment advisors, and it's why you tell them what you don't want to be invested in, and they find other things to be invested in. And that, you told them no tobacco, so they went and found other stuff. That's going to be what some of that money probably ends up going into. But there are real opportunities for reinvestment in all kinds of things. One of the places where there's real opportunity is in reinvestment in your own campus. So the Sustainable Endowments Institute just published a fascinating study of what's happened with these green revolving loan funds at campuses around the country. People take money, stick it in these funds, begin finding the best conservation, efficiency, renewable projects on campus or in the community. What they found was that as they did that, they were getting a return on investment averaged across 1,000 projects of over 28%. Now, the thing that's hard for us is we're used to thinking on the Board of Trustees at Dartmouth, there's a committee called the Investments Committee and a committee called, I don't know what it's called, Capital Operations or something like that. And we're used to thinking of these as separate things, and they're different people and they're different budgets. But in fact, if you're investing $1 million in much more efficient lighting, and you're getting a 28% return on investment, that's just as much an investment as sticking it in Exxon. In fact, if you can get anywhere near close to that, it's a hell of a lot better investment than sticking it in Exxon. So that's one place really to look, and it's one way to marry this desire to do something close to home on campus with the powerful political tool that is divestment.
Quick response, and that is an absolutely fabulous question. It's easy to get out of something, but what do you then do with the money that you got out of? And the answer is there aren't very many options, even if you use carbon and climate as the lens. Now, the one place that might suggest it, so you could go across sectors, by the way. I mean, whether it's the GEs of the world, the Goldman Sachs of the world, data centers, Microsoft, every one of these is dirty at the end of the day. For example, 40% of the emissions come from buildings, commercial and residential buildings. So we are dirty in the way that we live. I mean, we know that. 25% comes out of transportation today, etc. So there are no safe alternatives. So first, if you're honest, we will accept that with only degrees of unsafeness. Second, you brought up the issue of subsidies to fossil fuel, and people use that term somewhat loosely. I don't know what you meant, but you're absolutely right to say that there is a lock-in, especially in infrastructure. There's a highway system that's been created. There's a grid that's been created. And you're right that over time those are investments that have been subsidized by us. And the reason we did that was because it gave us clean, reliable. Safe, reliable energy in return that made wealth creation possible. And one might argue, look, maybe we should do the same for non-fossil fuel-based energy, for energy efficiency technologies, and technologies like that. And the fact is, tremendous amounts of investment are pouring into those sectors, but the returns are still exceedingly low. And what is worse, even those are very dirty industries you're talking about. Solar is an incredibly dirty industry. You look at that supply chain. Talk about violating every conceivable rule of sustainability in producing, that product. It's horrible stuff. In many ways, I think worse than nuclear, but that's my personal view. But the point I'm making is that even those kinds of investments, people have discovered for a whole host of reasons, aren't scalable. Company after company. I work with dozens of companies, the Owens Cornings, the Caterpillars, the Deeres of the world, and they're making tremendous investments in the kind of conservation and energy and carbon efficiency technologies and investments that Bill mentioned. What they've discovered, yes, the returns are high, the payback periods are short, but they're not scalable after a point. It's very tough to scale them, and companies are struggling with this issue. In fact, they would love to do more of this, but they're finding that they quickly bump up against limits. And even, if you could get returns out of them, what people have discovered with these is the returns quickly tail off. To give you an example of better lighting, do you know if we were to replace all of the commercial lighting and residential lighting with CFOs overnight, that would probably reduce about 3.5% of the GHG emissions. I'm not saying 3 to 3.5% is insignificant, but to me, should we do those? Yes, but are they the kinds of things that are sufficiently large investment scale that warrants all this money going in some? I'm very skeptical. So it's a great question. Okay, take the money out, what the heck do you do with it?
Thank you, that was great. I think, just to clarify, correct me if I'm wrong, Professor Kapuscinski, but in terms of talking about subsidies, it's the governmental subsidies to these companies that they're receiving. I know for a fact, I'm sure Billy knows the figures for the US. I know in Canada, fossil fuel companies receive $1.8 billion in subsidies. Worldwide, it's about $1 trillion. In the US, I'm sure it's a couple of billion as well. And I think it sort of goes back to what divestment is about. It's not just about physically divesting, but it's a political act. For me, anyway, it's about getting people to talk about these companies, to talk about how we're dependent on energy, how we can find solutions. But it's also raising public awareness and getting more people mobilized around this. And
I think for me, it's surprising to hear so much talk about how we need to cut government spending and how much debt we're in, and yet we're still subsidizing these companies. I don't really want that.
Yeah, just to say, fossil fuel subsidies are a perfect example of what happens when you have incredibly powerful companies that are determined. I mean, look, the subsidies for fossil fuel greatly outweigh what we're doing for renewable energy in this country and around the world. And if you think about it, that's crazy. We learned how to burn coal in the 18th century. What are we subsidizing at this point? It's like giving someone, a Pell Grant to get their 18th bachelor's degree. Subsidies should be used in any sort of economically sound scheme to help new emerging industries that are at the bottom of a cost curve and need some help along the way. And so it makes sense that we do that, and we should do more of it. But the reason that we don't do more of it, and the reason that we keep supporting fossil fuel industry, even though it's now killing us, is precisely because of their enormous political power, which is precisely the thing that you can do some undermining of if you take on this divestment task.
Back, right? Yeah.
How much of your divestment program do you feel is just based on education, the fact that us young people who are going into college don't really know about how bad it is, and how much is really strictly divesting and trying to hurt Exxon and these big companies, or the divestment trying to make it so that we can understand we actually can make a change no matter how small it is?
Yes. This is a very good question. The question is, how much of this is a kind of economic strategy and how much is a kind of educational and political strategy in a sense? In the first instance, as I've said, mostly a political strategy, an effort to change the relative power of these companies and weaken them some. The controlling example would be what happened with the tobacco industry. Okay? You guys there's only a few people in here like me old enough to remember a time when if you walked into a room like this one, it would be filled with tobacco smoke. The reason that it isn't anymore is because people stood up to that industry, weakened its political power, and we were able there then to pass the kind of set of sane laws that we now have. We need to be able to do that. Now, as we do that, okay, as we spread this word, one of the things that will happen is an economic pinch on these companies. Remember what those Citigroup and HSBC reports said. If we begin to call into question their ability to access those reserves that are 5 times greater than the amount governments have said we should burn, if we're able to do that, to kind of build that sort of momentum, then their share price will begin to waver, because other investors who aren't in it for some of the same ethical reasons that an university endowment should be in it for, some of them will begin to say, this does look like a bubble, and I don't want to get caught in it like I got caught in the housing bubble, and already this is starting to happen. There was a terrific piece in The Economist issue before last explaining that exactly this kind of cycle is beginning to happen. The biggest association of actuaries in the world just put out a big report saying pension funds need to be very careful now buying fossil fuels precisely because of this bubble. And what they need to figure out as they're making that decision is how effective people like you are going to be in bringing this message, okay? Because if you're effective enough, then you'll begin to put a real dent in their ability to keep doing what they're doing. And it must be said that when you do, that when we put a price on carbon, a serious price on carbon, when we weaken their political power enough to do that, well, that's the moment that the fossil fuel companies will become energy companies and start to do the right thing. Exxon is a company with great engineers and great scientists and great everything. They spend $100 million a day, looking for more hydrocarbons. In a world with sane economic incentives where they were forced to internalize the externalities of burning carbon, they'd be spending $100 million a day on something else, solar panels biofuels, whatever it was going to be, and we'd be making some real progress.
Yeah. Professor, I'm sorry, I don't remember your name, but this question's for you. You mentioned that you served on a committee that recommended divestment in the case of South Africa. So my question is, what makes global warming an issue where it's more difficult to use divestment? Or why would you be more cautious in this instance?
Because I think with apartheid, it was fundamentally at every level an evil and immoral issue. I'm not saying that the issue of greenhouse gas emissions isn't. I think it was Leehi that used the phrase smacking us in the face. In fact, it's one of the mega issues of our time. But I don't view it anywhere near in the same moral category as apartheid.
Just bear in mind, of course, that the same people like, say, Desmond Tutu, who thought that apartheid was a great moral evil and rose up to do something about it, spent their lives on it, are precisely the same people who are asking us to do this about fossil fuel, because they can see firsthand what the toll is. And remember that if you're in a place like Africa, you're suffering all the consequences and you didn't cause any of the problem. That's why those places have the real opportunity, with our significant help, and we've got to give it both for moral and practical reasons, to leapfrog the fossil fuel age, as they've done with telecommunications, and go straight to the renewable energy age. It's entirely doable. There's place after place where it's become clear that it can be done, and in fact, people are starting to try. The Chinese are a good example. I wrote a piece for National Geographic last year on China and energy, and spent a lot of time there. Now the Chinese took our advice 15 years ago and started building coal-fired power plants all over the place. And bad advice, and they've come to start to realize that because their cities are choking and because they're feeling the effects of climate change far worse than we are. The Pearl River Delta, where their industrial base lies, is 1 meter or 2 above sea level. The Himalayas, where their rivers come from, are melting quickly. They're in enormous trouble. And so they're working extremely hard and with a great deal of effectiveness to move off fossil fuels as fast as they can. They're the world's biggest installers now of renewable power. 25% of Chinese get their domestic hot water from solar panels on the roof. And here's an interesting story about that. I spent a day with the guy, Huang Ming, who runs Hemin Solar, the biggest of these solar hot water companies, talking about the fact that they were able to get 25% of Chinese to do this, while in the U.S. that number is less than 1%, okay? And most of that for heating swimming pools. And he said, I want to show you something. Come into my private museum, okay? And in his private museum, there was a kind of rusting solar panel sitting there. So you know what that is? No, what is that? That's one of the solar panels, solar hot water panels, that Jimmy Carter put on the White House in 1979, and Ronald Reagan took down in 1985 at the behest of the fossil fuel industry. What it demonstrated is that we lack not technology, but political will to put technology to use. In the few places that have, we're seeing remarkable things. The Germans are the one big Western country that took this threat seriously. There were days last summer when the Germans generated more than half the power they used from solar panels within their borders. Okay? That's in Germany. Think what a country could do if it had, Florida and Texas and New Mexico and Arizona and California, think what the developing world, much of which is happily located in equatorial regions that get a lot of sun, will be able to do. But only if we're able to get the fossil fuel industry out of the way fast.
Just a very quick question for Bill, or follow-up.
My question is, must we always be at the center of our conversation here? Must we as human beings always be at the center of our concerns? And I think your point about apartheid, and Professor, you were saying that it doesn't have the same moral weight. I would say moral weight I would disagree. And I think so often when we are having this conversation, particularly about climate change, it comes down to economics or science. And I think until we elevate this to a level of ethics that goes beyond our own species, to a conversation that looks at power beyond our own species and asks, what might a different kind of power look like, feel like, and can we extend it beyond our own kind, then I think we're really missing a huge point and opportunity in our evolutionary thinking, empathy, and real survival.
And just to underline, there was a report today in Nature Climate Change, a study showing that we expect at current rates plants to lose two-thirds of their habitat, and animals about 70%, animal species about 70% of their habitat by mid-century as the climate warms at current rates. We're setting off the 6th great extinction event in human history with this rapid warming. And this one, unlike the others, we don't need to do. We're choosing to do it, and we're mostly choosing to do it to make a few very rich people a little richer for a little while longer. That's the deal.
A couple of quick reactions, actually questions to you, Bill, on what you said. One, did you also see the cesspools of pollution from the solar industry in China during your visit there? A. What do you think about that? And B, and by the way, China is the center of the world's solar production today. And B, after fossil fuels, mining, and I'm excluding coal, but non-coal mining is probably the second most emitting industry in the world. What does Desmond Tutu think will be the impact of shutting down mining in Africa, especially South Africa?
It's entirely true that there are towns in China and in parts of Africa where, in search of some of the rare earth metals that people use in solar panels and things. In fact, there's one town in particular in China that people have focused on for the effects that the solar industry has had. And people have died, and there are no excuse for it, and there are plenty of ways to clean it up, and that work's underway. And it should go faster, and hopefully it will. It is, by any comparison, an infinitesimal fraction of the 100 million people expected to die from the effects of fossil fuel between now and 2030, almost entirely concentrated in the developing world. So I'd say that counts as a red herring of a remarkable sort. We gotta talk about this stuff. We're not faced with a world where one of the options is perfection. That's not one of the things that's on the table. We're now at the point of doing serious triage. And I think that the odds of a world where we're working on solar panels, of being able to clean that up successfully are considerably higher than the odds of a world where we're working on coal. In fact, already at this point, to talk about jobs and mining and things, look at this country. Even with the market penetration that we already have, there are more jobs in the solar industry in this country right now than there are in the coal mining industry. My guess is that Desmond Tutu would understand that there is enormous possibility for job creation in South Africa as we make the transition to renewable energy. Think about the difference between a deeply capital-intensive industry like fossil fuel, which is one of the lowest labor intensity in the world, and the high. If we're going to do the job in this country or any other country, it's going to mean weatherizing 100 million homes. It's going to mean putting solar panels on 100 million rooftops. Nobody puts their house on a boat and sends it someplace else to be weatherized. Not here, not in South Africa. That job's going to be done locally by local people, and when it's done, we're going to have stronger local economies as a result. It'll be a useful transition in all kinds of ways. Not the least of which, and this is something we haven't talked about here, but since we're talking about economics, let's talk about it for a minute. Not the least of which is it will allow us to avoid the almost incalculable economic cost of having rapid climate change. Lord Stern in the UK is the only person who's done a big study of what the effects of relatively unchecked climate change would be economically. He found that it would be greater than the effects of World War I, World War II, and the Great Depression combined. Okay, we can't afford anything like that. And yes, there'll be economic hit as we're doing this. It's not going to happen for free. But compared to the effect of trying to deal with a world where things like Hurricane Irene become commonplace, it's pocket change.
I have a quick question for the Dartmouth divestment team. I was just wondering how far you've gotten in communicating with trustees and such, because I could see some real resistance and bureaucracy being an issue in those advancements. So I'd just like to hear what you guys have done so far.
So far with the Divest Dartmouth campaign, we launched our petition in April, and around that time we also had a kind of informal meeting with the investment office. And we think that the next step going forward in our campaign is going to be to come up with concrete demands. The national campaign is focused on divestment from the top 200 fossil fuel extraction companies and on varying timescales. So the investment office has basically asked us to decide exactly what we're asking for, and that's something we're going to be working heavily on going forward. We've also really emphasized throughout our interaction with them and everyone so far that just like this event, it's going to be a dialogue. We're not about to go screaming through the investment office demanding anything yet. We really hope that we're going to be able to keep working on kind of a mutual playing field with them to come up with the best possible solution and timeline catered to Dartmouth.
If I could also add, when we're approaching the investment office, we want to also be sure that this is something that a lot of people want. We want to have a lot of support behind this. So right now we're working on building our support so that when we talk to the investment office, the trustees, hopefully at some point we'll be able to show them that there is a mass mobilization behind this on campus. Not just in terms of students, but in terms of faculty, in terms of community members, and in terms of alumni as well.
Real quick, can I just add, it's the advisory committee on the trustees group, it's not the actual office that you have convention created. Is that correct? Or no?
Well, I mean, so you're mentioning the advisory committee on investor responsibility. They make recommendations.
No, not that.
No?
The full board of trustees.
Oh.
You have to convince them, not the office itself.
No, it's not. The office itself does not have jurisdiction over how the endowment is managed or what we're invested in. It's the trustees, yes.
Okay, so in the interest of getting everyone back to their homework or to sleep, I think we're going to have to wrap it up here. It's been incredible. Thank you all so much for coming, and please feel free to stay and talk and ask questions. There is food upstairs. Also, we have sheets for you to sign the petition to the trustees if that's something that anyone would be interested in doing after the dialogue we've had here tonight. We also really encourage you to get in touch with us. It's divestdartmouth@gmail.com. We also have 350 New Hampshire representatives here tonight who would be delighted to talk to anyone who wants to hear about what they've been up to over there. And yeah, thank you so much for coming.
Good.